We've got an incredibly packed agenda today, so I'm really keen that we start on time. Not all of you were here yesterday, and I wanted you to see the venue from yesterday. It was stunning. But that's not why I wanted you to see the venue. That was a derelict building. Reconstructed, rebuilt, back at the heart of the community, providing a sense of pride to the local community, some employment, and a destination event space that's come top 3 years running. And the reason I wanted to start with that is we're about to have a really depressing presentation about climate change. And it is important to remember that it is not hopeless, that we can do things which will make our world a better place. We can address climate change. We can make tourism better. And that's really what today is about. It's about responsible tourism. It's about making tourism better. It's about using tourism to make a better place for people to live in and a better place for people to visit. We talked yesterday, or I did last night, about half-full glasses, mostly of beer in my case. The glass is half full, but if we work really hard and if we work together and if we work with partners, we can begin to fill that glass up and we can improve the world that we leave for our children. So that's really the objective of today. Now we're going to have a series of presentations which are about issues, but what I really want us to focus on today is what can we learn from from people's experience of working on these issues. What can we learn about process? What can we learn about what enables us to make change and to do it better and quicker? Because we do need to speed up the amount of change that we're making. So I want us to resist today debating the issues. I want us to focus on process and how we make the world a better place. So I'm going to be quite ruthless about that, and I'm asking all the chairs of the panels to do the same thing. Tempting though it will be to get into the issues, we need to focus on the process. We have two important keynotes to kick the day off. Both are about issues, and we will discuss the issues in the first panel. But for the rest of the day, I want to focus on process. But to kick off the day and to start the conference, the second day of the Responsible Tour, the 8th Responsible Tourism in Destinations Conference, I'm going to hand over to Simon Press from World Travel Market.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Harold, for inviting me to open the Friday of the conference. It's a fantastic opportunity, not for myself, but also World Travel Market. I'm the Senior Exhibition Director for World Travel Market, and some of you may have recognised me from last evening's Harold's inaugural lecture at MMU. And again, thank you very much, Harold, for inviting me to last night. I did eventually get there, and I did eventually manage to address everyone and say hi, and I hope that you enjoyed the drinks reception. I actually did also get to see that venue as well, a little bit by mistake, but it was a lot emptier. But I did get from that fantastic venue to the one that I should have been at via the entire campus. But I got there via the power of technology and sat-nav and a few helpful friends and being able to converse with people along the way. Quite an entertaining day, but we got there. And I think today is going to be a very entertaining day, but in a very different ways, and it should be very good, actually. As I mentioned last night, WTM's Responsible Tourism Day has captured the hearts and minds of industry professionals everywhere. And it is great to see so many people who have taken part in the World Responsible Tourism Day, especially on the panels and as part of the debates here today as well. Responsible tourism is the backbone of the industry. It helps us to give back to struggling communities, to converse with people from the very top to those people at the grassroots, and to conserve amazing biodiversity, stunning scenery, extraordinary heritage, and teeming wildlife. It should be on the boardroom agenda of every travel company everywhere. And that's the opening conversation and debate that I made at WRTD in November of last year as well, and something that I feel that should be as the first comment to all responsible tourism debates going forward as well. While I nor WTM profess to be experts on the subject of responsible tourism, I have learned a lot over the years, and I said that last night, and I learned a lot last night as well, and I'll continue to learn a lot every day with regards to this topic. And believe that conferences and events like today's Responsible Tourism and Destinations Conference and WTM's Responsible Tourism Programme are of vital importance. These events help to inspire, encourage, educate, and motivate by involving experienced industry executives that will help us to tease out the problems, explain new thinking, and probe possible solutions. And they're not all about patting ourselves on the back and going, well done, we've achieved that, tick, put your feet on the desk and sit back and take all the applause. That's not what this is about. It's continuously striving for the next part where we need to be going along this journey. The growing need, yet understanding for responsible tourism is reflected in the addition of the new Centre for Responsible Tourism and new MSc in Responsible Tourism at Manchester Met. The main topics that we plan to cover today are all popular subjects that are constantly arising during the WTM Responsible Tourism Programme, and we've increased that programme across our other events out of WTM that takes place in November in London, but now in Sao Paulo and also in WTM Africa, and hopefully we'll be extending that further as we extend the portfolio of leisure events that we do as part of READ Travel Exhibitions, READ Exhibitions. One, and I'm sure we're going to be discussing this throughout the agenda, the conversation today, but one of the topics that must be on everybody's lips and has probably affected everyone sat in the room in some shape or form has to be the recent floods that hit the UK recently. The UK winter weather has become a flashpoint in the global debate over whether climate change is taking place and how governments should respond to it. Although impossible to say the flooding was a result of climate change, I'll throw it out there, is it? I don't know. Nearly half of the people polled by a global civic organisation recently believe that the floods and storms that have ravaged Britain for the past 3 months are a result of climate change. People are thinking that. Something not to be ignored, as it brought with it devastating outcomes. However, off the back of this, it is also great to see that the government responded, making £2 million available to help firms which rely on tourism in flood-affected parts of England, along with Visit England hosting advice sessions to help those affected as well. Is that too much? Is it too little? Again, throw that out there. It's important that tourism businesses that have been affected by the horrendous floods get back on their feet as quickly as possible. And just this morning, whilst I was sat in my comfort of the hotel, watching BBC, I was understanding that they've reopened the line this morning where it connects southwest through to the other parts of the country, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. But to understand and to be living through that for the last couple of months when they haven't had that arterial route there, well, that's a life-changing and also life-changing event that has damaging effects on businesses in that area. B&Bs, hotels, everything like that, through whatever reason, the public opinion may be, my personal thoughts are, public opinion may be that actually the Southwest is closed for business. Really? You can get there through other ways, yeah, but the train's down. But some of those businesses have been virtually closed or empty for the last 2 months, so it's fantastic that that's back on track again. Climate change will also be on the agenda, forgive me, for the seamless link back to World Travel Market and a bit of a sales pitch here. But climate change will also be back on the agenda at this year's World Travel Market as part of the WTM Responsible Tourism Programme, along with sessions covering key topics such as child protection, wildlife and animal welfare, and also social inclusion, all key areas which I know have a growing relevance in the industry. I hope that by tackling key issues today and throughout the year, such as environment, economy and society, will aim to drive change by educating more responsible tourism behaviour within the travel industry and encourage the industry and the consumer to drive the responsible tourism agenda forward. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a very productive day. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to introduce Kevin Anderson, who's from the other Manchester University, where I did my PhD 100 years ago. Kevin, you've got 20 minutes to tell us how bad the problem is, and I hope leave us with some hope.
I call this talk the ostrich or the phoenix, and I hope you're familiar with both of those. The ostrich is what we've done on climate change since we first started to think about it seriously in the early 1990s, which is to stick our head in the sand and pretend it'll just go away or that it doesn't really exist. And the phoenix, I say, is the phoenix arising from the fossil-fueled flames, sort of thinking to try and to resolve these problems. And the sort of subtitle of this is cognitive dissonance, which is the ostrich, which is a fancy academic term for hypocrisy, or creativity in a changing climate, that the climate is changing and we have to be much more creative in how we think about the problems that we're going to try and face and resolve. I always get told my talks are a bit depressing and that I should be giving razor blades away at the end of it, so I'm going to start off with a more upbeat headline conclusion. Avoiding dangerous climate change, and I mean by that stabilisation of the atmospheric temperature above the pre-industrial period. I don't know if any of you are aware of this sort of language, of 2 degrees C, and I'll come back to that later. But avoiding dangerous climate change remains a feasible goal of the international community, just and only if we radically reduce energy consumption now. And now that has big implications for your industry and basically for every other industry out there. That it's not about technology that will solve the day in 2030. It's about getting our energy consumption down today. And I'll come on to why that is. That's going to be the main sort of focus, that this is not a problem for the future, it's a problem for today. In fact, it's really a problem for yesterday. And one foreign word in this, Fredag, which I'm not Swedish, but that's Friday in Stockholm. Friday the 27th of September last year, the main science report came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And then there's one just released this week, as you've probably heard about in the press, talking about the impacts of climate change. This was the science report last year. It offered neither surprise nor solace to our fossil fuel hungry world. The science message for policymakers really hasn't changed since the first report came out in 1990 rather. So the message hasn't changed. We're a quarter of a century on, and really nothing has happened in the science. And that's because it's a mature science. Why would you expect it to significantly adjust? It goes through the sort of things that science always does, small adjustments. Climate science was investigated back in the 1800s, so it's been going there for many years. It's not a new thing. The skeptics about this misunderstand the idea that the science underpinning climate change is just the science that we've always done. It's just basic O-level physics. There's nothing significantly different. It is a mature science. So what has changed, though? Since the last report in 2007, we've dumped 200 billion tonnes of CO2 in the atmosphere. 200 billion tonnes. The lights today in here will be again contributing to that. And the lights today that will be using coal-fired and gas-fired power stations to keep them going, the CO2 in the atmosphere will be there for between 100 years and 10,000 years, changing the climate. So today's event is changing the climate for the future. Emissions now are 60% higher than when we first claimed some interest in climate change back in 1990, when the first report came out. And the atmospheric levels of CO2, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, are now are higher than they've been for at least 800,000 years. And that is longer than we've been here as a species on the planet. That's about 3 times longer. So roughly 2 or 3 times longer than human beings have been on the planet. That's how much the CO2 has been higher than before that period, and possibly even further back, possibly up to 5 million years ago. Repeatedly, we commit to this statement. This is the statement from the Copenhagen Accord, but you can look at it in all the international negotiations that occur every year. David Cameron and all the other great and good have signed up to something very similar to this statement, to hold the increase in global temperatures below 2 degrees centigrade, and that's actually very important here, the below part, but I won't get much chance to talk about that today, and to take action to meet this consistent with science. There's a radical idea, and even more than that, on the basis of equity. I mean, we're all rhetorical on this stuff, but this is actually, we should hold our paymasters to account. We, as a democracy, are all signed up to that. So why radical reductions in energy demand? Why have we got to do something about it now? Surely we can just wait for clever people in engineering to solve it with wind turbines and nuclear power station and carbon capture and storage and these other things. Well, it's all about timing. And actually, I like those engineering solutions. I come from that engineering background. But unfortunately, the maths don't play out in its favour. It's all about timing. And we're in 2014 now, and as I say, we've done nothing about climate change in the last 25 years. Temperature relates to cumulative emissions, to the build-up of carbon dioxide day in, day out in the atmosphere. So if this lecture room is used tomorrow, the lights will be keeping the planet warmer again as it adds more CO2 into the atmosphere. So it's about the area under the curve. It doesn't matter what happens in 2050. 2050 targets, 80% reduction by 2050, is a dangerously misleading way to think about climate change. It has no scientific legitimacy. It is the cumulative emissions that matter, the carbon budgets. Let's think about this graphically. For those that like numbers, this is billion tonnes of carbon dioxide up the side. Those that don't really like numbers, it's just lots of CO2. And we probably all like dates along the bottom, 1980 to 2050. We first started concerned about climate change back in the 1980s. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up in 1988. We had the big Rio Earth Summit, for those of you with grey hair or no hair that will remember the first one in 1992, which was very hopeful about what would happen in the future. Royal Commission report in the UK in 2000. Notice the line of CO2 emissions, see what it's doing, just going up and up. The more conferences we have about climate change, the more it goes up, because we always fly to them, of course. Copenhagen Accord, 2009, the Rio plus 20, it's thought it was Rio plus 20 years. I think it was Rio plus 20 billion tonnes, because during our time of concern, that's our concern line going up. And more recently, despite the economic downturn, what we've seen is that emissions have gone up by about 5% in 2010, and that was probably an anomaly that year. But still, they're going up about 2 or 3% per annum. They're going up at rates that are faster than they occurred during the Industrial Revolution from a much, much higher base. So there's no sign at all at the moment of emissions coming down. What are future emissions? Well, think when we lock ourselves into doing things. Think of the hotels you're using and the other things in the tourist industry that are part of your infrastructure. When you build those, you're locking the future into using them. Power stations are going to be there for 25 to 50 years, or a nuclear one probably 60 years if it's relicensed, and a tidal system might be there for 100 years. Large-scale infrastructures, most of Manchester is based on Victorian sewage networks and probably 1930s to 1950s gas networks. So infrastructures are there for 100 years or so, very commonly. The built environment, this is a relatively modern building, but look at the other buildings you'll find within the Met or with the Manchester University, you'll see buildings there that are well over 100 years old. I live in a building that was built in 1860. So we build things and they last for years. Aircraft and ships, you're talking about 30 years life for an aircraft, 27 years, then it goes on to be a freighter in Africa. Ships, very similar to that. So when you build these things, they last for years. The Boeing 747 was invented in 64, sold in 69. We still make them today. Unless you're an aviation geek, you couldn't tell the difference between one that we first sold in 69 and one that you see today. They're a bit more efficient, but that's about it. If the A380 follows that line, it will be in the air in 2080. That's how long we're locking the future in. There are 30 to 100 years at least for these sort of infrastructures. So let's extrapolate out current trends, and you get an emission curve that looks like that's a fairly optimistic emissions curve. And there's a lot behind that, which I'm not going to go into now, but just to give you some sort of handle on what, firstly, the question is that realistic? If emissions keep going up, they are doing that, and they're kicking up very fast at the moment. Just think of the UK, one of the leading nations on climate change. Just think of what we're doing on climate change. We're doing a lot of really important things. We've given tax breaks to shale gas. Fossil fuel, 75% carbon, pumps out a lot of CO2. The Chancellor's proposed 30 new gas-fired power stations. We've had the highest level ever investment in North Sea oil last year, second highest will be this year. We've reopened 3 Scottish coal mines. We're expanding aviations and ports. We've watered down the car legislation on emission standards. We've rejected a decarbonisation target for 2030. We're supporting Arctic exploration for hydrocarbons because we hope to use our hydrocarbon industry to help get the oil out from underneath the Arctic now that the Arctic's melting because we've got the oil out previously. And we've opened a consulate in Alberta, conveniently next door to where the tar sands are in Canada. That's what we're doing in the UK, and we're one of the leading nations on climate change, so not surprisingly, emissions keep going up. And we're set at the moment, for those of you who like the numbers, to about that much CO2, roughly out to 2050, and by the end of the century, that much. And remember what I said before, it's the area under the curve that matters. These are the carbon budgets. That's what we're pumping into the atmosphere over the next 50 to 100 years. That's what we're setting up. That's a 4 to 6 degrees C temperature rise. 4 to 6 degrees C is a global average. Bear in mind the difference between now and the glacial period is about 5 degrees. These are temperature changes that normally occur over about 10,000 years, if not more. And we're bringing that about in about 100 to 150 years. If we're going to stick to this 2-degree threshold, the threshold between acceptable climate change and dangerous climate change, and let's be blunt about this, 2 degrees C mean that many poor people around the world will die. So the threshold we've accepted internationally in negotiations is one where we will accept that many thousands, if not millions, well, many millions of people in the southern hemisphere, they're poor, they're a long way from here and look culturally different to us, that a lot of those people will die at 2 degrees C. And that's why a lot of them argue we should be aiming for 1 degree C rise, not for 2. But globally, we've accepted this 2 degree C rise. And if we're going to do that, we've got about 1,000 gigatons to spend, compared to if you saw 5,000 up there. Yeah. So we have very little time left, very, very little time. If we carry on as at the moment, we would have used up all of our carbon budget by 2032. So by 2032, there'll be no carbon left if we carry on at the current rates of using emissions for the threshold that we all internationally sign up to year after year. And those numbers support the IEA, not a left-wing think tank, the International Energy Agency, traditionally seen as being the spokesperson for a lot of the fossil fuel industries. The IEA chief economist, Fatih Birol, has made the point that the CO2 trend is perfectly in line with a temperature increase of 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and this would have devastating consequences for the planet. That's the International Energy Agency. It's not Friends of the Earth or WWF. The IEA are saying we're heading towards 6 degrees C by the end of the century. Now, whether it's 4 or 6, either way, it's devastating. The point I'm trying to make here, which is quite an important point, is that this bit here, as it curves off, the first part of this, this is our emissions going up, and we need to bring it down really rapidly. The first part, the bit we need to do immediately, we can't do with energy supply. We can't build enough nuclear power stations, wind turbines, solar panels, or any of that. We cannot build them fast enough. So the first part of coming down off the curve means we have to reduce our energy consumption, and that brings our emissions down. And that's the only way out of it to start off with. Now, the supply part is really important, but that will come later. We won't get significant reductions by changes to low-carbon supply until 2025, 2030, at the earliest. So we need to reduce demand. And again, for your industry, as with most industries, that is an enormous challenge. What do you do? Now, that's a global analysis. You then sort of say, well, actually, we're signed up to on the basis of equity, which means that the poorer parts of the world should be given a larger part of the carbon cake that we've got left. And the rest of us then have the smaller part that's beyond that. And I mean, none of us here would, certainly openly, we wouldn't disagree with that. We think it's appropriate for the poor parts of the world to be able to develop and improve their welfare. So, passing on these other slides, not much point you seeing them really, but what I'm saying here is that if you play the maths out for this, then you have we require reduction rates of about 10% per annum. 10%. Every single year, year on year, for at least the next 20 to 30, well, at least the next 20 years. So that means for the wealthy parts of the world, people like us in our parts of the world, for your industry, for other things I'm involved with, we need to have about a 40% reduction in our absolute emissions by about 2018. These are guideline numbers, but it's something like that. About a 70% reduction over the next 10 years. 70% reduction. Think of that in your industry. What would that mean? And about, well, not far off 100% reduction. So we have to be virtually moving fully decarbonised by about 2030. And there's a lot of maths and numbers behind this, and I'm happy to discuss that later if you want to. So that's why I'm saying you need radical emission reductions to deliver the early parts of this. This is to give us an outside chance of avoiding dangerous climate change. So these are very challenging numbers for all industries. Now the question, of course, then is, well, this looks too difficult. Is 2 degrees C too difficult? And we're already on the cusp of, that's why the probabilities are important. We're on the cusp of 2/3, the way we're going at the moment anyway. Well, even if we do a lot of the things we say we're going to do. So the question then is, well, what about a higher temperature future? Could that be okay? If you go to a 4 degrees C future, that gives us a larger carbon budget. We don't have to reduce emissions so fast, so our industries can cope and develop and technically change. The question then is, can we live there? Is a 4 degrees C world a place where we can live? I mean, 2 degrees C, we're killing a lot of poor people a long way away, and we don't really care about them. We haven't in the past. We pretend to, but collectively as a society, we never have. But 4 degrees C, maybe those chickens will come home to roost here. Will they? If not, why don't we just aim for 4? These are taken from the Hadley Centre and the Foreign Commonwealth Office numbers. If you imagine the hottest days of the year during a heat wave, then what we're talking about within Europe is adding 8 degrees on that. The 2003 heat wave, where 20 to 30,000 people died across Europe, adds 8 degrees temperature rise on top of that. Think of what's starting to happen. Your tarmac's starting to melt, your power lines aren't bringing power to your fridges and your freezers and your water pumps that you'll need to keep cool and keep your water and your food preserved, because as the temperature goes up, the soil moisture evaporates out the ground and the cables can't transfer as much power. So you get a whole load of these knock-on feedbacks. In China, imagine some of the buildings in Beijing and Shanghai not built with much thermal inertia, so as the temperature goes up, the temperature inside rockets. So you see about 6 degrees temperature rise there. And you can use air conditioning units to help with that, but if you've got one and your neighbour hasn't, then you're helping kill your neighbour, because the air conditioning unit will pump in extra heat outside. And that's what happened partly in Marseille, is that some of the people who were with them killed their neighbours who hadn't got them. And in North America, since it's good or bad news, 10 or 12 degrees C, depending on your view of those people. So we're talking about massive changes in temperature. We're also talking about huge changes in sea level. We're talking about 80 centimetres rise, up to about 1 metre by the end of the century. Just think about what that means. That is an enormous change in sea level. The impacts, so I mentioned the floods already. The floods may not have been caused by climate change, but they were certainly exacerbated by it, as was Sandy, as was Haiyan. We've had 20 centimetres of sea level rise so far, and the damage that was caused was exacerbated by that additional sea level rise. So we're heading towards that now. This is my major concern, because I don't really care about the rich parts. We should have done something about this years ago. Is the poor parts of the world. We're talking about massive reductions in the production of some of their staple crops, at the same time as the population is heading up towards 9 billion. So we're talking about a world of conflict, a world of scarcity, and a world where many people will be dying as a consequence of us doing what we're doing today. There's a widespread view amongst the science community, and you'll see that from the report that came out, that a 4 degrees C world is incompatible with organised global community. When we get that much strife and conflict, we don't reach for the debating table, we reach for the Kalashnikov. It is beyond adaptation. Most societies will not be able to adapt to these sorts of changes that we're locking into the future with everything we do today. It's devastating to ecosystems, and that's not just some barrier reef that we can't go and visit because it's dead. That also means things like the pollinating bees and so forth and other insects that provide our food supplies that allow us to eat. So these systems are not just external, they're also very important to the way we live our lives. Personally, I think it's important, the external ones as well. And it's highly unlikely to be stable. If you head towards those temperature rises, you're likely to start to create natural feedbacks that will exacerbate it. It will get worse and worse, and what we do by then isn't irrelevant. So virtually all the scientists who work on this say we should avoid 4 degrees C temperature rise at all costs. And 4 degrees C is a global average. Given that most of the globe is made out of the oceans that take a long time to warm up, the lands will be 5 or 6 degrees C, which means those temperature rises you saw before during heat waves. This does not spread evenly around the planet. And it's much worse on land. So going beyond 2 degrees C is not viable. We have to aim for that. We're probably going to miss it a little bit, but we should aim for it as best that we possibly can. So to conclude, my judgment, as I said before, is that we can do something about this. We are on the cusp of failing, but we have some choice if we make changes now. And this is what I normally focus on, but I'm going to touch them now. There are 3 pillars to this that I would suggest. One is that we know who emits. And we see them when we put our makeup on in the morning or when we shave. They're people like us. It's a very small proportion of the world's population emits. Probably somewhere between 40 and 60% of the world's emissions come from probably something like about 1 to 5% of the world's population. A very small proportion. It's not a problem for the poor, it's a problem for the wealthy today. It's about consumption, not about population. Technology on the demand side can deliver very rapid changes. Fridges are a good example. An A++ fridge uses 85% less energy than an A-rated fridge. So why are we selling rubbish A-rated fridges? And fridges get replaced about every 8 years on average. You can do the same analysis for cars or toasters or lots of other things. On the demand side, technology can make radical reductions in our emissions as long as we don't use the energy we saved to take more flights or to buy a jet ski. So the rebound effect is very important. And growth. We're obsessed by growth, yet we never question why or what it means. There are lots of alternatives to measures of a good life. Security, time with your family, lots of those sort of things are important to us that don't necessarily mean we have to see economic growth. And beyond the threshold, a particular threshold, there is no sign of improvement in welfare. And that's repeatedly been shown, analysis after analysis. Up to a point, GDP is important. Above that, an increase in it gives you no improvement in quality of life. So I would suggest what we need is a radical plan here with 2 phases. One is we have to reduce energy demand now. Think, what does that mean for your industry? That means flying has to be dramatically curtailed. Ships are also very polluting. These are some of the things that allow people to travel to the places that some of you will be talking about. And these are things that if we carry on doing as we're doing, we are locking the future into 4 degrees C. At the same time, we need a Marshall Plan build program for low carbon energy supply. So we need to build all the low carbon options are out there like there's no tomorrow, but we can't build them fast enough, and hence we have to reduce our energy demand in the short to medium term, and that means starting now. So I'm going to a couple of final slides here. We have to escape the 20th century mindset to solve 21st century problems, and that we're still not. We're still stuck. We're probably still stuck in the 19th century, but we need to move into this century and start to think of the problems differently. If we're going to deliver on 2 degrees C, that's going to require leadership, courage, innovative thinking, engaged teams, and very difficult choices. This is a quote from Robert Unger. I've used this almost every talk I give. I think it really captures the essence of the problem, really, and of the solution. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination that conceive that it could be different. Clarity and imagination, that's what we need to think about. What could the future look like? It doesn't have to look like the past. In fact, it will not look like the past. Either we'll change it because we've made the reductions in emissions so it'll look very different, or if we do nothing, then it'll look very different because the climate will change it for us. So we need clarity, we need imagination. This talk and other ones are on my website, kevinanderson.info, and I have a Twitter account where I link to other things that I write. So I'm not sure that's 20 minutes or not, but I did hear the bell.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. And we are going to go straight into Simon Robinson's presentation, which is similarly, I think, a really important keynote. It takes up exactly where you left it. It's about responsibility for making a difference. So Simon is going to talk about that using examples, I think, from health and the financial crashes.
Could be, yeah.
I hope so. And then there will be time for questions. So please hang on to those questions for Kevin and for Simon. And remember, I really want us to focus on how do we make a difference, if we can, in that discussion.
Good to be here amongst all the academic tourists, and yeah, okay. And it's good to be here focusing on responsibility. I'm coming in as a philosopher, so I hope it'll complement the practitioner and the scientist. We'll see how it goes. We're focusing on the credit crisis. Conventional analysis of the credit crisis, straightforward stuff. I'm not going to go into any detail. You can get that in any articles. Obvious, mortgages to subprime lenders. Why would you do that? Why would you give a mortgage to somebody who can't pay it back? Question mark. CDOs, so you parcel the debts together and you move the debts across and you sell them. Why would you do that? I work with an awful lot of Muslims, and they can't understand why you sell debts. Takeovers, failure of risk analysis. Why would you buy an organisation when you don't know if it's got toxic debt? Not a full analysis. Poor regulation. 4 years before the credit crisis, the regulators in different areas were making noises, but were not doing anything about it. Nobody was listening. Poor regulation. 10 years before the credit crisis, there were similar things happening, but nobody actually remembered that. Nobody was looking backwards. Nobody thought about the past. Amazing. Short-term profit, we're into that, of course, and this is one of the key reasons why people are not looking at their social and physical environment, because it's the immediate short-term profit. So you make your profit, you pass on your CDOs, this collection of mortgage debts. You've made your profit, and what happens next? That's the other guy's problem. And of course the other guy immediately says, right, I'll sell it on too. And it's the pass the parcel, the music stops, and this time the guy who's left with the parcel is the guy who's in the deepest. Yeah. Governments, please, one of the biggest problems is that the governments are not taking the blame that they are owed. Mrs. Thatcher, deregulation. This is where all the things began to happen in terms of the credit crisis. But not just that. If you look at the mid-staffs report, really quite fascinating. The mid-staffs, the report, the Francis reports, 2 of them on the mid-staff crisis. They say, well, the government wasn't really to blame. We blame the regulators, and we blame the board, and we blame this and that. But the government was to blame. And was one of the key problems, because they formed the framework within which key targets were taking people's eye away from the key purpose of the organisation. Academia, we are to blame. We are to blame. Please look at the Inside Job, 2011, Sony. It's a great DVD narrated by the Born Supremacy guy. Wonderful stuff. And towards the end of it, it suddenly shifts to Harvard Yard. Is it anybody here from Harvard? Okay, that's good. Because it then shifts to the head of the economics department, and the question that is raised of this chap is it really reasonable that at least 4 of your professors are being paid £100,000 a year to be on various major boards? There's not a conflict of interest. The head of the economics school, who looks about 16 and obviously comes from England, scratches his head and conflict of interest. What is a conflict of interest? They haven't even got that far. One of the key issues emerging from this is that Harvard continuously was supporting the finance industry with positive reports about the way that they were running these things. Extraordinary. Not extraordinary. Before Enron collapsed, there were at least a dozen articles in top journals by Harvard academics which said Enron is one of the best run organizations in the States, including ethically. Whoa, amazing. Right, okay. That's what we have as the usual conventional analysis. And bits start to emerge from this about questions of responsibility. And so Obama and Gordon Brown and all the rest say we are now moving into a new age of responsibility. We will leave all that behind. But what is that responsibility? What does it mean? We're here for a responsible tourism conference. What does responsibility mean? I'm not clear that even at this stage, after the credit crisis, that there has been, from the top, a sufficient analysis of what that actually means. Some people, by the way, say that one of the causes of the crisis, in terms of the short-term profit, was this notion of greed. But don't forget that Gordon Gekko argued that greed is good. So I want to put a little caveat here, and that there is a philosophical tradition back to 1714 which argues that greed is good. I want to say three things. That responsibility is divided into imputability, which is about connection between here and action, and that becomes agency, so that's number one. Number two, that it's about accountability to, and we'll come to that shortly. And number three, that it's about liability for, and how we develop that liability. When we look at this, we see how these things were not practiced within the credit crisis, and from there you can see how that's worked through into the health industry in different ways. Agency, decision making, is about knowing what you are doing, knowing what you are thinking, knowing how you perceive the world, and what your purpose and values are. Wow. And the effect of that on your social and physical environment. There's an awful lot of stuff there, isn't there? Normally we don't sort of begin to locate that in our everyday conversation. But actually, I want to argue that we do. Illustration. When I was working this with a group of nurses, one of them said, yes, I understand what this is about. This is phronesis. We can't go into the formulation of phronesis. But her illustration was great. She said, I had 5 minutes to go before the end of my shift, and my boyfriend was waiting outside, and we had to go to a flat that both of us thought was fantastic. This was going to be the beginning of our wonderful relationship. Had to be there. Went in with 5 minutes to go to see an old man who and do the normal observations and so forth. 3.5 minutes in, the old man begins to cry. What do I do? She said. Do I say to him, don't worry, my friend, there'll be somebody here shortly, knowing full well that there'll be an hour before the next shift kicks in? Do I listen to him for a minute, as the textbooks say, and then say, fear not, I'll come back and see you tomorrow, I'll stay with you, my friend, I'll stay with you, my friend? Or do I stay with him? And do I leave my boyfriend at the front door? I could always call him, but she said, I chose to stay with him. This was the practice of phronesis, and we practice this in our everyday relationship. The problem is, the leaders within the credit crisis were not practicing it. It comes back down to the notion of responsibility as practice. They weren't doing this. They didn't know what their purpose was. They didn't know what they were doing. Classic case. So Fred Goodwin, asked by the parliamentary committee to miss to go. Okay, right. Asked by the parliamentary committee, he said, they said to him, what qualifies you to be the head of a bank? His response was, I have an MBA from Harvard. That does not qualify you to be the head of a bank. Okay. Now, you see this throughout the whole approach. The parliamentary subcommittee, which looked into the boards, noted that most boards were headed by retailers, not by bankers. They did not know what they were doing. Most of the bankers did not understand the mathematical formula underlying the whole credit crisis. They did not know what they were. Why are you paying so much money to somebody who does not know what they are doing? Big questions. All of that brings us down to the notion of agency, which is really about identity. As we're working it through, we're working through who we are, what we are, how we relate to our organisations. Give me 3 more minutes. That's fine. The accountability is very straightforward, but one of the key points about accountability is that the conversation about this is almost always one way. Accountability is mutual, very often asymmetrical, and that's a difficult one. How do you work out mutual accountability in an asymmetrical relationship, different power and so forth and so on? But what's key about this is the way in which accountability has now, in the last decade and more, it's become focused in instrumental rationality. We give an account in terms of our metrics, in terms of our targets, etc. We don't give an account in terms of our purpose or our relationships. Key questions that have to be followed through there. The third notion is, how do we work out our responsibility for, right back to Kevin's notion, for our world? How do we work that one through? It's tied actually to perception. Universal responsibility, the idea of being responsible for everything, is tied to perception, how we see the world. If we don't feel responsible for everything, we don't actually see those poor people in that part of the world where our unintended consequences lead to their demise. Are we responsible for our unintended consequences? If you're a Muslim, you know you are. If you're a Christian, possibly, you know you are. Big questions about ultimate accountability. 1 more minute, okay? But you see this throughout the boards and the bankers. No question of how that can be worked through. And therefore, they do not see what is around them or under their noses. Working it through then, a whole bunch of issues, and I'll leave those with you. How do we develop a responsible culture in the organisation? I agree, speed is important, but actually we also have to make haste slowly, because if you don't develop a responsible culture, you do not develop responsibility. And part of that development of responsible culture is how you develop phrenesis, critical questioning in your organisation, so that you don't have to whistleblow, so that it's automatically reasonable to ask questions of peers and of leaders, etc. Cross-cultural responsibility, what's that all about? Can responsibility be a bridge between cultures, or is it a difference? Big question there. All of this begins to say that we should be given an account, not just of our practice, but of our philosophies. When I had a conversation with Andrew Lansley 4 years ago in Cambridge, I said to him, what is the philosophy of your health organisation? He said, we wouldn't use such kind of language. Precisely. We as practitioners are responsible for our meaning and our philosophy. And if we don't work that through, we can't give a full account of what we're about, and we can't move into real practice. Dialogue, the practice of dialogue and the dialogue of practice, we've got to keep moving on. I think the 2 final points, forgive me, the 2 final points. One is, we've got to look at this question of how identity and responsibility relates to shame. Because actually shame has got to be one of the key motivating factors. Now, most of the healthcare stuff recently tries to say put shame and put guilt to one side. No, reasonable to work on what shame is about. I think that can be done effectively, and I think there are lots of ways of working with things like Confucianism that can do that across cultures. And finally, responsibility and madness. Actually, irresponsibility takes us into the world of madness. Delusion, dissociation, and denial. All of those things were there in the critic crisis. Extraordinary. Time up. Okay. 10 seconds. All of those things were there. Quite extraordinary that we should have psychopathology at the very heart of our leadership. And don't forget that one of the estimates is that 17% of major corporate leaders are psychopaths. We'll leave it there. Okay.
Thanks, Simon. I'm not going to be so indulgent with anyone else. I don't know how you manage to get away with that kind of thing every time you speak. I should say, Simon and I are hoping to do some work together on cross-cultural understanding of what responsibility means. I'm really looking forward to that. But it's your time now. It's time for questions. Please, can you come out and just use this? Who's next? Please come out, Justin. Come and make a queue.
My question to Kevin primarily. Thank you for the feel-good start to the morning. I don't think there's anyone in the room who doesn't 100% agree with the thrust of what you're saying. My question is, why? What else can we do on a communication front to try and get the message through? Because the science is overwhelming, and there's no point in even debating as far as I'm concerned. And yet, even Monday morning, where the latest IPCC report came out, even in relatively highbrow media outlets, there's always the balance, there's always the counter-argument, there's always the yes, but maybe there's some good news to come from this story as well. And you can almost feel, maybe it's just the BBC, but you can almost feel their pain and their anguish as they think about, the negotiations on the licence fee, and that may be clouding how they're balancing these messages. But it feels to me as though we never quite get to the hard-edged messaging and public awareness that is required to make the breakthrough. So there's always the bad science, and it's catastrophic, but actually there's a counter-argument. And how do we engage with the media in a more responsible way to make sure that the clarity of message comes through and cuts through people's awareness?
I think, Stephen, what you meant was, how do we hold their bottom to the fire?
Or perhaps our bottom to the fire. Well, I'm not a specialist in communication. A lot of my colleagues work in this area, but I have to say that I think, and it's not meant to avoid the question here, but actually I think examples are probably one of the best forms of communication. People actually doing it. So there's lots of people can talk about how we would communicate the things that need to be done, but actually, where do we look to see those examples? I mean, society doesn't support them anyway when people are doing them. But so I work in a university, and I'm not an example. I'm a very bad example, like probably all of us here. But I've decided not to fly. I haven't flown for almost 10 years now. That has been very challenging in a university, because the university expects you to fly to lots of international conferences, and they say you haven't been to very many. I've been to lots virtually, but not actually gone there physically. Now, doing that is quite difficult. But the more people do it, the easier it becomes. You start to make these, and that feeds into communication. You start to make what seems to be the odd eccentric become the new norm. And that in itself, I think, starts to communicate through society that these things are achievable. So my big argument about the IPCC, and this is one of the reasons I've explicitly made this decision a lot of years ago, now almost 10 years ago, not to actively engage in the IPCC, which I have a lot of respect for, but you have to do a huge amount of travelling. So I was not prepared to join because of that. I think the IPCC should have set an example and should have gone out of its way to demonstrate how you can do something like that, which would be very difficult, without lots of travel. All the major negotiations, they should be done with minimum travel. If anyone flies there, well, there should be very few people fly there. Most people should go by train, and actually most people shouldn't be there. So I think that, I don't mean to dip the idea of communication, but I think that actually until people start to demonstrate what you can do to bring the emissions down significantly in our day-to-day lives, so in your industry, what can you do, then I think it's very hard for us to really communicate these messages effectively. So we need those early leaders to start to demonstrate changes in what we do, either in our own lives or in our own industries.
Just a quick... I think I would want to say communication is key. And if you go to the PR industry, the international PR industry, and Gregory, for instance, they are working through with governance organisations, with Moving King in South Africa. They're working through this notion of including PR in the responsibility development within corporations. So communication becomes quite key. Communication has often been seen as simply the idea of getting across what I want to get across. Communication has to change and has to move along the line of responsibility, and therefore I think we need to move into much more conflict resolution techniques. If you look at the conflict resolution techniques, they move into how can you identify with the other. They work that one through, and for me, that's where they should be going. But that means more dialogue and more focus on dialogue.
Just one quick follow-on from that is I think there is no universal appropriate approach to communication. That actually we have to make them culturally specific, not only to different cultures, but to different groups of people within those cultures, to different industries. So I think we have to tailor our communication to the people we're trying to communicate to, and that's quite difficult in something like the BBC, where it's got a very large captured audience. And how do you engage with that? Because people will see it very differently. If you're talking to the well-read, nicely educated, middle-class Guardian readers like me and probably quite a few of us here, you might take a different approach to communication if you're talking about some of the poorer people that read the tabloids. So people will respond differently to messages, and I think that's quite a subtle thing that we've often missed, actually.
Kevin, the only conclusion from your presentation is that the only conclusion basically is that we need to start flying less, and we need to start flying less now. And what that means is that those tourism businesses that have an international component will get smaller. What effectively is being asked of the tourism industry is to get smaller, to lose jobs, to create less benefits. Now, I don't think the industry is going to volunteer to do that. And I also don't think enough consumers are going to volunteer to fly less either. So where are you on taxation? Aviation fuel is not taxed, it's not subject to VAT, and despite air passenger duty, is basically heavily, heavily subsidised. Do you think there's a role in taxation of aviation fuel in order to create the reductions that we need quickly?
I did some work on this quite a few years ago. One of the problems with aviation is it's actually, although we all like to pretend it's people who are poor flying to Benidorm, actually that's not where the drive is in the increase in flights. It's by the relatively wealthy flying a lot more often. And actually we're inelastic to the price. So I did some work some time ago looking at carbon prices. If you had a €300 carbon price, and it's probably, I don't know what it is today, but let's guess it's somewhere between 5 and 15 euros a day for the carbon price per tonne. If you had a €300 carbon price, which no one was talking about at the time, that would make a 25, and all of that was passed to the passenger, that would make a 25% difference to the flight. So you're going to go to Rome for £125, £150, it's going to add, what is it, £37.50 to the price of your flight. You're still going to go. So people like us are pretty inelastic. And most people that fly are inelastic to price. So the problem with price, I would put the tax on anyway. I think it's just inappropriate not to have the tax on it. But I don't think price is something that most of the people who are flying will be significantly affected by. You have to put it so high that detrimental effects on others would outweigh the benefits. So I think price is a very blunt mechanism because we have to take account the equity dimensions. That's not to say we shouldn't put there should be tax on it. And there's 1944 Chicago Agreement means there's no tax on international aviation, fuel, which seems ridiculous to me because it has to compete with other sources of travel, which actually do have to pay tax. But I think we have to find alternative mechanisms, whether they're sort of regulatory standards, possibly even rationing. At the end of the day, we're all rationed by our salaries. That's why only relatively wealthy people fly. So I think we have to find alternative mechanisms, of which price will be one of the ones, but it's a relatively small complement.
Just a very, very quick point, I think, Concern, is I totally agree with the need to fly less. I think that's a no-brainer. We all understand it. But I think as a tourism industry, we've talked so far about how that might affect jobs in the tourism industry and the international travel industry. I think we have a responsibility as well to look at who's that going to affect in destinations. Because if you think about Gambia, for example, we have a colleague here from Gambia. Most of the people arriving in Gambia as tourists, I guarantee probably every single one of them almost arrives by air. You have an economy that, with our encouragement, has become much more dependent on tourism. Then we all stop flying. We don't suffer because we have lots of other places we can go on a train. We have lots of other things we can do. We'll simply transfer our demand. What's going to happen to those destinations that we've helped to make very dependent on tourism if we stop flying? That's something I think we have to look at. I don't think we ignore the not flying issue. We have to challenge that issue. We have to deal with that issue. But we have to understand the implications, I think, of what we do. And unless we look at what happens to those people, we're not taking real responsibility. We're just making ourselves feel better. And I think we need to focus on that a little bit more.
Can I just a question. Does academia have a specific regulation stroke policy on this? In other words, all of us fly. Last year I flew 12 times. My institution has no policy in terms of rationing, etc. So that industry needs to work on it.
Tom, this will be the last question.
Thanks. Tom Bunkley, Yellow Railroad. Can I just firstly echo that last point? I like to think, I'm an international tourism consultant. I work in a lot of emerging economies, developing countries. I like to think I'm helping redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor world. A fantasy perhaps, but I like to think there's an element of that. And I think it's absolutely true in the same way that if we don't buy green beans from Kenya, we're going to put a lot of Kenyan farmers out of business. It would be nice if the developing world could live on subsistence economy, but that is not going to to happen. So I think there are real moral issues we have to think about when we're doing that. And when we're demonizing air travel, and I don't dispute what's been said, but let's think about the other things that pump out carbon. Fashion industry. How many of you own more than 2 pairs of shoes? How many of you own more than guys, more than 2 suits? How many women own more than 2 frocks? I'm showing my age. Dresses, things that, so there's a lot of stuff we have that we don't need that causes an enormous amount of carbon to be pumped out, but it does create employment. So that's an issue. But can I ask, the question is to Kevin, again, it's the elephant in the room I'm revisiting, but China is pumping, huge development, massive stuff that dwarfs what we're doing. There is a Swedish economist, and I've just lost his name for a second, who says, let it happen, because they will very quickly get over this pumping out carbon phase, and there's massive amount of really big research going on there into good technology. So where are we on that? What's your view on that? Or has the damage already happened, and whatever is going to happen in China? Okay.
We got the question.
Well, actually, the two bits fit together, actually, because it's interesting that China at the moment are building 150 international airports. If they flew as often as we fly, and bear in mind only a few people in Britain fly, if they flew as often as we fly, they'd have to build 450 new international airports. So the point about aviation is that there are no alternatives in terms of the fuel sources in the next 20 to 30 years that we can envisage, and therefore it locks us in to a high carbon future. And that would have the impacts of that climate change will affect the green bean growers and the people who provide the tourist industry in Gambia anyway. So I think there is a knock-on effect there. As other industries, the making of shoes and socks and the fashion industry, which I think I agree, all sectors need to do something. But actually, a lot of them have a technical option as well as the behavioural option, which the aviation industry simply doesn't have and is growing out of proportion. But then a lot of industries are at the moment. When it comes to China, China's a very large emitter. But bear in mind that probably somewhere around about a third of its emissions relate to the products that we use over here. Our shoes, our clothes, our laptops are made by the Chinese, then we blame them for the emissions. So about a third of the emissions relate to that. They are doing a huge amount of renewables. Everyone says they're building one or two coal-fired power stations a week. They're putting up roughly 1 wind turbine every hour. They've got more solar panels than the rest of the world to put together. The reason that solar power is taken off in Europe is because the Chinese have subsidised their solar industry so they can sell them abroad. And we don't like that because we believe in this nonsense called free markets. But actually, we're buying their solar panels, and actually we're starting to generate large proportions of the energy across Europe now are starting to emerge from solar panels that are growing very rapidly around the globe. So China is doing a huge amount. A lot of bad things, a lot of good things. But overall, I think China is probably a real powerhouse for innovative change in a very rapid and very short time frame that we in the West are simply failing to deliver on. So I think I see China as a slightly more hopeful driver of change than I do perhaps us over here.
Just quickly, I agree with all that. The fascinating thing is, again, this cross-cultural thing in terms of China. How are we going to get that across? How will we communicate with them? How will we work that through? No other way other than actually having good critical dialogue around the key cultural underpinnings, questioning them as they can question our key cultural underpinnings.
I'm really sorry to draw it to a close, but it's coffee time. I'd like to thank our 2 keynote speakers. And if I might say at a personal level, I hope I'm going to work a lot more with both of you in the future. Kevin and Simon, thank you very much